5 years of marriage. That's how long I thought I had a rock-solid relationship with Adele Ice. We were the couple people admired, or at least that's how it seemed. We'd built a life that felt stable and full of potential. No kids yet, but we had plans. We'd talk late into the night about baby names and how we'd decorate the nursery someday. Looking back now, those conversations feel like some cruel joke, like I was living a lie and didn't even know it. Last week, my best friend Jim called me out of the blue, saying he needed to talk. It was urgent, he said, but he wouldn't tell me why over the phone. I didn't think much of it at first. Jim's the kind of guy who keeps his emotions bottled up, so I assumed he was finally opening up about something personal. Maybe work stress, a breakup, normal stuff friends talk about. We met at a small cafe near my office. It wasn't our usual spot, but he chose it, probably because it was out of the way. When I got there, he was already seated, staring into his cup like it held the answers to whatever was eating him alive. Jim looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, his clothes a little more rumpled than usual. He barely managed a weak smile when I sat down, which set off alarm bells in my head. Something was definitely wrong. Before I could even ask what was going on, he blurted it out like ripping off a band-aid. I slept with Adele Ice. At first, I thought I'd misheard him. My brain refused to process the words. When I realized he wasn't joking, it felt like someone had sucker-punched me. I couldn't even speak. He went on, filling the silence with apologies that felt like knives twisting deeper with every word. He said it happened months ago, one drunken night after a party. They both regretted it immediately, he claimed, but for some reason, that didn't make it any easier to hear. I tried to gather my thoughts, but before I could, Jim pulled out his phone and showed me messages. I didn't want to look, but it was like a car crash. I couldn't look away. There it was. Proof. Messages full of guilt, vague apologies, and just enough context to confirm he wasn't lying. I didn't know whether to feel grateful he was coming clean or furious that he'd betrayed me in the first place. When I asked why he was telling me now, he said the guilt was eating him alive. He couldn't stand pretending everything was fine between us. He said he knew he deserved whatever fallout was coming his way but wanted to be honest before I found out some other way. I sat there, staring at him, feeling my whole world unravel. Jim kept talking, but it was like his voice was coming from underwater. I wasn't angry, at least not at first. I was numb. The betrayal didn't fully hit me until later, but in that moment, I just sat there, silently absorbing the worst news of my life. After a while, Jim stopped talking and just waited for me to respond. What was I supposed to say? I told him I appreciated his honesty, but forgiveness? That wasn't on the table. Not yet, maybe not ever. He nodded, looking miserable, and said he understood. The hardest part came after. Driving home, I felt like I was in a fog. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my stomach churned. I kept asking myself, how could this happen? How could the two people I trusted most betray me like this? I didn't have any answers, just this overwhelming feeling of dread about what was waiting for me when I walked through that front door. When I got home that night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, Adele Ice would be in the kitchen or curled up on the couch with her latest book, but when I walked in, she was nowhere to be seen. Her car was in the driveway, so I knew she hadn't gone out. I stood there for a minute, staring at the space we'd made into a home together. The pictures on the walls, the throw blankets she loved to collect, even the stupid potted plant by the window she named Gerald, it all felt tainted now. Like a scene from a movie where the husband comes home and doesn't know everything's already fallen apart. Eventually, I found her in the bedroom. She was folding laundry, humming softly to herself, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. For a second, I just stood there in the doorway, watching her. She looked so normal, so innocent. It made me sick. How could she act like nothing had happened when my entire world had just crumbled? I walked in and sat down on the edge of the bed. My chest felt tight, and I wasn't sure if it was anger or grief. Probably both. She must have noticed something was off because she stopped what she was doing and asked me if I was okay. That question hit me like a slap. How could she ask me that when she was the reason I wasn't okay? I told her we needed to talk. Her face changed immediately, her usual warm smile replaced by a cautious, almost wary expression. I didn't waste time dancing around it. I told her I knew about her and Jim. The words tasted bitter coming out of my mouth. For a moment, she just stared at me, frozen. Then came the denial. She acted confused, like she didn't know what I was talking about. But when I mentioned the messages, her face went pale. She knew she was caught. Instead of apologizing, she started making excuses. She blamed the alcohol, said she didn't mean for it to happen, that it was a mistake. A mistake. Like accidentally spilling coffee on the carpet. She tried to justify it, saying it didn't mean anything and that she didn't want to hurt me. That's when the anger hit. I asked her how she could do this, how she could betray me with someone who was like a brother to me. She didn't have an answer, just more weak excuses. She even tried to shift some of the blame onto me, saying we'd been distant lately and that she felt neglected. That one almost made me laugh. Neglected? I worked my ass off to make her happy, to give her the life she said she wanted. And this was how she repaid me? The argument went on for what felt like hours. She cried. I yelled. She begged me to understand, to forgive her, but I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The more she talked, the more I realized she wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was just sorry she got caught. By the end of it, I was emotionally drained. I told her to pack a bag and leave. She looked at me like I'd slapped her, but I didn't care. I needed space to think, to process everything. I told her to go to her parents' house and that I'd be contacting a lawyer. She tried to argue, said I was overreacting, but I stood my ground. I couldn't look at her anymore. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Eventually, she left, slamming the door behind her. As soon as she was gone, the weight of everything hit me all at once. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty doorway, feeling like my chest was being crushed. The silence in the house was deafening, but for the first time, I realized how much I hated it. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was her and Jim. I'd trusted them both with everything, and now I didn't know if I'd ever trust anyone again. The morning after Adelice left was surreal. I woke up to a quiet house, but not the kind of peaceful quiet I usually enjoyed. This was the kind of silence that came after a storm, when everything's been destroyed, and you're left staring at the wreckage. I tried to stick to my normal routine. I brewed a pot of coffee, but it tasted like ash. I turned on the TV, but I couldn't focus on the screen. Every part of me wanted to pretend that this was just a nightmare I'd eventually wake up from. But it wasn't. This was my reality now. Around noon, I decided to call Adelice's parents. They had a right to know what was going on, and honestly, I needed someone else to carry some of this weight. When her dad picked up, he sounded chipper, like he was genuinely happy to hear from me. That made it even harder to tell him. I explained everything as calmly as I could, though my voice kept cracking. I told him about the affair, about Jim, about the messages. There was a long silence on the other end before he finally spoke. He sounded devastated, like I just told him his daughter had died. He thanked me for letting him know and said they'd talk to her. He didn't defend her, didn't make excuses, just apologized over and over for what she'd done. A few hours later, Adelice's mom called me. She was less understanding. She said I was being rash, that I should have given Adelice a chance to explain herself. I told her there was nothing to explain, and honestly, I was done hearing excuses. I wasn't in the mood to argue, so I hung up before she could say much more. Jim called me later that day too. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. He sounded just as miserable as he had the day before. He told me he'd understand if I never wanted to see or speak to him again, but he hoped we could talk eventually. He kept saying he didn't deserve my forgiveness, but he wanted to try and make things right. I told him I needed time. That was the truth. I didn't know how I felt about Jim. On one hand, I was furious with him for betraying me, but on the other hand, at least he'd had the decency to come clean. That was more than I could say for Adelice. By the end of the day, I felt completely drained. I hadn't eaten, hadn't showered, hadn't done anything but sit in the living room, staring at nothing. I realized I couldn't keep living like this, not if I wanted to get through it. The next morning, I forced myself to go for a run. Exercise had always been my way of clearing my head, and I needed that more than ever now. As I pounded the pavement, I started making a mental checklist of what needed to be done. First, I had to get a lawyer. If this was heading for divorce, and let's be real, it was, I needed to be prepared. I also needed to figure out what to do about Jim. Could we ever be friends again? Could I even look at him without thinking about what he'd done? And then there was Adele. Part of me still loved her, or at least the version of her I thought I knew. But that version didn't exist anymore. The woman who smiled at me across the dinner table, who held my hand during movies, who talked about baby names like we had all the time in the world, that woman was gone. And I didn't know if I'd ever get her back. By the time I got home, I felt a little clearer, if not better. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I had a plan, or at least the start of one. It wasn't much, but it was something. The rest of the week passed in a blur. Adele texted me a few times, but I didn't respond. She wanted to talk, to explain, but I wasn't ready for that yet. My focus was on survival, on getting through each day without falling apart. The weekend felt like an eternity. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressing down on me with every passing hour. I tried to keep busy, but nothing seemed to stick. Every task felt pointless, every room felt colder without Adele's presence. Even though I was angry, part of me hated how empty the house felt. By Saturday, I decided to take back some control, starting with clearing out her things. I wasn't throwing them away, just packing them into a box. Her toothbrush, the bathrobe she always left draped over the chair, even her favorite mug that said, "Coffee first, questions later." All of it went into the box. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small step toward reclaiming my space. Around midday, my phone buzzed. Another text from Adele. Her messages had been relentless all week, cycling between apologies, explanations, and outright anger. This one was calmer. She said she wanted to come by and talk. She promised it wasn't to argue or beg, just to have a conversation. I stared at the screen for a while before replying, finally agreeing to let her come over. When she arrived, she looked fragile. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hair tied back in a messy bun that she hadn't bothered to fix. She was holding her phone in one hand and her purse in the other, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure if she was welcome. We sat at the dining table, the same spot where we'd shared so many meals, so many plans for the future. She started talking right away, her voice trembling as she apologized for hurting me. But as she went on, her words shifted. She talked about feeling neglected, about how she thought we'd grown distant over the years. She brought up the drinking, saying it clouded her judgment. It was every excuse in the book, but none of it was what I needed to hear. I waited until she finished before I said anything. I told her I wasn't interested in excuses. I needed to hear her take responsibility for what she did, not deflect it onto me, our marriage, or a few glasses of wine. Her face crumpled, but instead of apologizing, she got defensive. She said it was just one mistake, one moment of weakness, and I was being cruel for holding it against her. That's when I stood up. I wasn't going to let her guilt me into letting this slide. I told her the conversation was over and that if she couldn't own up to her actions, there was nothing left to discuss. She looked at me like I'd just slammed a door in her face, but I stayed firm. As she left, she turned back and asked if there was any chance we could fix things. I told her the truth. I didn't know. How could I, when I didn't even recognize her anymore? That night, I sat on the couch, staring at the box of her things I'd packed earlier. I wasn't sure if I felt better or worse after seeing her. All I knew was that I needed to prepare for the possibility that this was the end. I opened my laptop and started looking up divorce lawyers. Not because I was ready to file, but because I needed to know what the next steps would be. Sunday morning started like the days before, silent and heavy. The kind of silence where every little sound, like the hum of the fridge or the creak of a floorboard, felt amplified. I tried distracting myself with chores, folding laundry and organizing drawers I hadn't touched in months. But even then, my thoughts kept circling back to Adele and everything that had happened. Her last words from the day before echoed in my head. Is there any chance we could fix this? I'd said I didn't know, but the truth was, I couldn't even imagine what fixing would look like. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. By mid-morning, I knew I couldn't sit with my thoughts any longer. I decided to go for a drive, No destination, just the open road. I grabbed my keys, threw on a jacket, and got in the car. The fall air was crisp, the kind of weather Adele Ice loved for long walks. That thought hit me like a gut punch, but I shook it off and started driving. The drive gave me space to think, though I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. My mind kept replaying our conversation from the day before, picking apart every word she'd said, every excuse she'd made. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got, not just at her, but at myself. How had I not seen the signs? Were there signs? Or was I just blind because I wanted to believe we were happy? Eventually, I found myself parked at a small diner we used to go to when we first started dating. Back then, we'd sit for hours, talking about everything from our favorite movies to our dreams for the future. Now, the place felt hollow, like a shell of those memories. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the cars passing by. As I sipped my coffee, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through the list of divorce lawyers I'd bookmarked the night before. Their websites all looked the same. Smiling faces, promises of fighting for your best outcome. It felt clinical, detached. But maybe that's what I needed. I called the first name on the list and set up a consultation for later in the week. Hanging up the phone felt strange, like I was finally taking a step forward but didn't know what direction it would lead. When I got home that afternoon, there was another text from Jim. He said he wanted to talk, to explain more about what had happened. Part of me didn't want to hear it. What could he possibly say that I hadn't already heard? But another part of me, the part that had shared a decade-long friendship with him, felt like I owed it to myself to listen. I told him to come over the next day. Not because I was ready to forgive him, but because I needed answers. If I was going to move forward, I needed to understand how the two people I trusted most could betray me like this. That night, I sat on the couch with the TV on in the background, not really watching. I wasn't sure what the next few days would bring, but for the first time, I felt like I was starting to take control of my own story. The next day, Jim showed up just after lunch. I heard his car pull into the driveway and watched him sit there for a moment, like he was debating whether to come in or drive away. Finally, he got out and walked to the door. He didn't knock right away, and for a second, I thought he might turn around. But then there it was, a hesitant knock, like he was afraid the sound alone would break something. I opened the door, and for a moment, we just stood there. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his hair unkempt and his clothes rumpled. His face was a mix of shame and nervousness, and when he finally met my eyes, it was clear he'd been rehearsing what to say. I let him in and motioned toward the couch. I wasn't about to offer him coffee or make this comfortable. This wasn't a friendly visit. He sat down, his hands clasped tightly like he was holding himself together. He started by apologizing again, stumbling over his words as he explained how it all happened. He talked about that night, about how he and Adele Ice had been drinking and one thing led to another. He said he didn't know why he did it, only that it was the biggest mistake of his life. But I wasn't interested in excuses. I cut him off and asked the question that had been haunting me since he told me the truth. Why didn't you stop it? He looked down, his shoulders slumping as he admitted he didn't have a good answer. He said it wasn't planned, that it just happened in the moment, but I wasn't buying it. Then I asked him if it was more than just one night. He hesitated, and that hesitation felt like another betrayal. He swore it wasn't, that it had only happened once, but the seed of doubt was already planted. Could I even trust anything he said at this point? The conversation shifted, and Jim started talking about our friendship. How much it meant to him, how he couldn't believe he'd thrown it away. He said he'd been carrying the guilt ever since and finally couldn't take it anymore. That's why he confessed. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to throw him out and tell him we were done. But another part of me, maybe the part that still remembered all the times he'd been there for me, wanted to believe he was genuinely sorry. I told him I appreciated his honesty, but forgiveness wasn't something I could just hand out. He nodded, his eyes glassy, and said he understood. He told me he'd give me all the space I needed, but he hoped that someday we could find a way back to being friends. When he left, I felt more drained than angry. Seeing him like that, a shadow of the person I'd called my best friend, was harder than I expected. But it didn't change what he'd done. That evening, I sat down with a notebook and started writing out my thoughts. It wasn't something I usually did, but I needed to get everything out of my head. As I wrote, I realized how much of my anger wasn't just about the betrayal, it was about the loss. I'd lost my wife as I knew her, and now, I'd lost my best friend too. The question now was whether I could rebuild anything from the ashes or if it was better to just let it all burn. That night, something shifted. After Jim left, I sat in the quiet of the house, replaying the conversation in my head. His apologies, his excuses, they all blurred together until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I realized I'd spent the past week drowning in everyone else's feelings. Jim's guilt, Adela's regret, even their excuses for why it had all happened. And in the middle of it, I'd forgotten about myself. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked exhausted, older than I remembered. My face had a dullness to it, like I'd been running on fumes for years without realizing it. And maybe I had. That's when it hit me. I'd spent so much time trying to hold everything together. My marriage, my friendships, this image of a perfect life, that I hadn't stopped to ask if it was worth it. The truth was staring back at me in the mirror. I couldn't go back to the way things were. Even if Adelice begged for forgiveness or Jim somehow proved his loyalty, the damage was done. I stood there, gripping the sink, and made a decision. I couldn't keep living in the ruins of my old life, waiting for things to fix themselves. If this was rock bottom, then I needed to climb out of it, and that meant making some radical changes. The first step was filing for divorce. It wasn't about punishing Adelice or getting revenge. It was about reclaiming my life. I didn't trust her anymore, and without trust, there was no foundation left to build on. The next morning, I made an appointment with the lawyer I'd called earlier in the week. The receptionist was polite, efficient, and didn't ask too many questions. When I hung up, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since this nightmare began, I had a clear path forward. That same afternoon, I called Adelice. I kept it brief, telling her I'd made my decision. She started crying, asking if we could meet to talk it over, but I told her there was nothing left to discuss. This wasn't a decision I made lightly, and I wasn't about to be swayed by another round of excuses. She begged me to reconsider, saying she'd do anything to make it right. But I told her that trust wasn't something you could just patch up like a broken window. Once it was gone, it was gone. She didn't argue after that, just said she needed time to process. I told her I'd already given her all the time I could. After the call, I sat on the couch, staring out the window at the changing leaves. Fall had always been my favorite season. Something about the crisp air and the way the trees shed their old leaves to prepare for new growth. I realized that's what I needed to do. Let go of everything that wasn't serving me anymore and make room for something new. That evening, I packed up more of Adelice's things and put the box in the garage. It felt symbolic, like I was clearing out not just the physical reminders of her but the emotional weight too. For the first time in days, I slept through the night. And when I woke up, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The morning after filing for divorce felt strange. Not liberating exactly, but different. There was a heaviness still lingering in my chest, but it was mixed with a sense of resolve. I'd made my decision, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't second-guessing myself. I started the day with a run. The air was brisk, biting at my face and lungs, but I pushed through. Running had always been my way of clearing my head, and today, it felt like I was running toward something instead of just away from the chaos. When I got home, I opened my laptop and started going through old documents and pictures. I didn't want to delete everything yet, but I needed to separate myself from the past. I moved the photos of Adelice and me into a folder, labeling it Archived. It wasn't about erasing her, it was about making space for myself. Throughout the day, there were moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. Filing for divorce felt so final, like burning the bridge that connected me to the life I'd spent years building. But then I'd think about the betrayal, the lies, the excuses, and I'd remember why I was doing this. Adelice called me that afternoon. I almost didn't pick up, but part of me wanted to hear what she had to say. Her voice was quiet, hesitant, as she asked if we could meet one last time to talk. She promised it wasn't to argue or plead, just to have closure. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I told her we could meet at a park near her parents' house. It was neutral ground, and I didn't want the conversation to happen in the house we'd shared. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench with her arms wrapped around herself. She looked tired, like the weight of everything was finally catching up to her. As I sat down, she thanked me for meeting her, her voice barely above a whisper. She started talking about our marriage. The good times, the dreams we'd shared, the plans we'd made for a future that now felt so far away. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a glimpse of what could have been if things had turned out differently. But then she tried to explain the affair again. She said she hadn't been thinking clearly, that she'd let her insecurities and frustrations get the better of her. She talked about feeling disconnected and how Jim had been there, in a way she felt I hadn't. I stopped her before she could go further. I told her I wasn't interested in rehashing the details. What's done is done, and no amount of explanations would change that. I reminded her that this wasn't just about the affair. It was about the lies, the betrayal of trust, and the fact that she hadn't taken responsibility until she was caught. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, she didn't argue. She just nodded and said she understood. She asked if I thought we'd ever be able to forgive each other someday, and I told her honestly that I didn't know. Forgiveness wasn't something I could offer yet, and I wasn't sure if I ever would. When we parted, it felt final. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no promises to stay in touch. Just a quiet understanding that we were moving on in separate directions. That night, I sat on the back porch with a beer in hand, staring up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel so heavy. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something close to it. After my meeting with Adele Ice, something shifted in me. The idea of moving on didn't just feel necessary. It felt urgent. The life I'd been holding onto was already gone, and clinging to it was only dragging me further into the past. I realized that if I wanted a fresh start, I couldn't just file for divorce and call it a day. I had to tear everything down and rebuild from scratch. The first big change was selling the house. It wasn't an easy decision. It was the place where we'd built so many memories. But every corner of it was haunted by what had happened. The kitchen where we used to cook dinner together, the living room where we'd laughed over movies, it all felt tainted now. I called a real estate agent the next morning and started the process. By the end of the week, there was a "for sale" sign in the yard. Seeing it there felt strange, like closing the book on a story I wasn't ready to finish, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Next, I quit my job. That decision surprised even me. I'd been at the same company for nearly a decade, and while it paid well, it never really excited me. It was just a job, something I did because it was safe and stable. But after everything that had happened, safe and stable wasn't enough anymore. I gave my 2 weeks' notice and started researching new opportunities. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted it to feel meaningful. Something that made me excited to get out of bed in the morning. In the meantime, I started purging the rest of my life. Clothes I hadn't worn in years, old furniture, random knickknacks. All of it went into donation boxes. It was like I was shedding the weight of my old life, making room for something new. My friends noticed the changes, and a few of them reached out, concerned. They asked if I was okay, if I was sure I wasn't making decisions out of anger or grief. I told them the truth. I wasn't okay, not yet. But these changes weren't about running away, they were about finding myself again. I also decided to start therapy. It wasn't an easy step. Part of me felt like admitting I needed help was a sign of weakness. But the truth was, I couldn't keep carrying everything on my own. I needed a space to process what had happened and figure out how to move forward. My first session was awkward. I didn't know what to say or where to start. But the therapist was patient, letting me open up at my own pace. By the end of the hour, I felt like I'd taken a small but important step toward healing. One of the most drastic changes came a few weeks later. I'd always dreamed of traveling but had never made the time. There was always an excuse: work, money, responsibilities. But now, with the house on the market and no job tying me down, I realized there was nothing stopping me. I started planning a road trip across the country, something I'd always talked about but never thought I'd actually do. The idea of being on the open road, exploring new places, meeting new people, it felt like exactly what I needed. As I sat down to map out my route, I felt a spark of excitement I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since everything fell apart, I wasn't just surviving, I was looking forward to something. 2 weeks after listing the house, I loaded up my car with the essentials. some clothes, a tent, a few personal items, and a notebook I planned to fill with thoughts and sketches of the places I'd visit. I hadn't told many people about the trip, just a few close friends who knew I needed to get away. The first few miles felt strange, like I was leaving behind more than just a house. This was the first time in years I was doing something entirely for myself. No compromises, no obligations. Just the open road and whatever lay ahead. I decided to start small, driving to a state park a few hours away. It was a place Adelice and I had always talked about visiting but never did. As I set up my tent under the canopy of trees, I realized how much of my life had been spent waiting for someday to do the things I wanted. It hit me that someday doesn't come unless you make it happen. The first night alone was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I sat by the campfire, staring at the flames and thinking about everything that had brought me to this point. It was the kind of introspection I'd been avoiding for weeks, but now, in the stillness of the woods, I couldn't escape it. I thought about Adelice and how much I'd loved her, how certain I'd been that she was my forever. But I also thought about how blind I'd been, ignoring the cracks in our relationship because it was easier to believe in the illusion of perfection. That night, I wrote in the notebook for the first time. I didn't hold back, spilling every thought and emotion onto the pages. It felt raw, almost too raw, but cathartic in a way I hadn't expected. In the days that followed, I drove to small towns and scenic overlooks, stopping whenever something caught my eye. I met people along the way, some travelers like me, others just locals curious about the guy with the beat-up car and the road map. One evening, at a diner in a tiny town I couldn't even find on a map, I struck up a conversation with the waitress. She was in her mid-40s, with a warm smile and a no-nonsense attitude. When she asked what brought me to town, I told her I was on a journey to figure things out. She laughed and said, "Aren't we all?" Then she told me about how she'd left her corporate job in the city to move here and start over after her own divorce. Her story wasn't the same as mine, but it felt familiar in a way that made me feel less alone. That night, I thought about how many people out there were reinventing themselves, finding ways to start over after life had knocked them down. It gave me hope that maybe I could do the same. The further I traveled, the more I realized how much I'd needed this. The road was freeing, but it was also grounding, forcing me to confront who I was outside of my marriage, my friendships, and everything I'd tied my identity to. One morning, I woke up early to watch the sunrise over a canyon. As the light spread across the rocks, turning them shades of orange and gold, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't full peace, not yet, but it was a glimpse of it, a reminder that there was still beauty in the world, even after all the pain. That moment stayed with me as I packed up and hit the road again. For the first time in months, I wasn't just moving forward, I was moving toward something new. After a month on the road, I felt a pull to settle somewhere, at least temporarily. I ended up in a small coastal town that seemed frozen in time. It was quiet, with a main street full of mom-and-pop shops and a harbor dotted with fishing boats. Something about the place felt right, like it was asking me to stay a while. I rented a tiny studio apartment above a bakery. The smell of fresh bread in the mornings was enough to convince me I'd made the right choice. But once I'd unpacked my few belongings, the question loomed, what next? One afternoon, while wandering the town, I stumbled across a second-hand shop that was going out of business. Its dusty windows were filled with old furniture, vintage lamps, and odd trinkets. Inside, the owner was boxing up what hadn't sold, muttering about the lack of interest in other people's junk. I wasn't sure what possessed me, but I offered to buy some of the unsold pieces. The owner was eager to unload, and within an hour, I had a mismatched collection of old furniture, picture frames, and rusty tools sitting in the back of my car. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at my haul. Most of it looked like it belonged in a landfill, but I saw potential. I'd always been handy, fixing things around the house or repurposing old items to save money. Why not turn it into something more? The next day, I started experimenting. I sanded down a battered wooden table, refinished it with a coat of bright teal paint, and replaced its wobbly legs with sturdier ones. When it was done, it didn't look like a forgotten relic anymore, it looked like it belonged in someone's home. I took the table to the weekend market in town, setting up a small booth with a few other pieces I'd restored. To my surprise, people stopped to admire my work, asking if I had more or if I could take custom orders. By the end of the day, I'd sold everything I brought and walked away with more money than I'd made in weeks. That first market was the spark I needed. I threw myself into restoring furniture and creating one-of-a-kind pieces from items most people would consider junk. Old crates became shelves, antique doors turned into coffee tables, and broken lamps were rewired and given new life. Word spread quickly. People in town started calling me the upcycle guy, bringing me their own pieces to restore or asking me to find something unique for their homes. I wasn't just fixing furniture. I was helping people see the beauty in things they'd written off. Over time, I turned the business into something more formal, naming it Second Life Creations. The name felt fitting, not just for the furniture, but for me, too. The business grew steadily, and within a year, I was renting a small workshop on the edge of town. What surprised me most was how fulfilling it was. Every piece I worked on felt like a metaphor for my own journey, taking something broken and giving it a second chance. I wasn't just rebuilding furniture. I was rebuilding myself. As the months passed, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. The business wasn't just paying the bills. It was giving me a sense of purpose. For the first time in years, I felt truly successful, not because of money or accolades, but because I'd created something entirely my own. Looking back, I never would have guessed that betrayal and heartbreak would lead me here, but in a strange way, it had. Losing everything forced me to find out who I really was, and for that, I was grateful. A year after starting Second Life Creations, I felt like I was finally in a good place. The business was thriving, the town felt like home, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like my life was defined by what I'd lost. I wasn't looking for love, it felt too soon, like I still had too much baggage to sort through. But sometimes, the best things happen when you least expect them. Her name was Mara. She ran the bakery below my apartment, the same one that filled my mornings with the smell of fresh bread. We'd crossed paths plenty of times, exchanging polite hellos or chatting briefly about the weather. But one day, as I was carrying a restored chair down the stairs, she stopped me and asked if I could fix an old wooden bench that had belonged to her grandmother. When she brought it up to my workshop, she stayed to watch me work. We talked as I sanded and stained the bench, about our families, about how she'd ended up in the town, about her dream to open a cafe someday. Her laugh was warm, her smile easy, and before I knew it, hours had passed. Over the next few weeks, Mara became a regular visitor. She'd bring me coffee and pastries while I worked, and in return, I'd help her with odd jobs at the bakery. We fell into an easy rhythm, and before I realized it, I was looking forward to her visits more than anything else in my day. One evening, as we sat on the dock watching the sunset, she told me about losing her mom a few years ago and how it had left her feeling adrift. I opened up about my divorce, something I hadn't talked about much since moving here. She didn't judge or pity me, she just listened. That was the moment I knew Mara was different. She wasn't trying to fix me or fill a void. She just wanted to be there, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could let someone in. We started dating, slowly at first, but it didn't take long for her to become a part of my life. She encouraged me to dream bigger, to think about expanding my business or even teaching workshops on furniture restoration. I, in turn, helped her sketch out plans for her cafe, offering to build the tables and shelves she'd need. Months later, I asked her to come with me to visit my parents. It was a big step. I hadn't seen them much since the divorce, and I wasn't sure how they'd react to me showing up with someone new. But Mara insisted it would be good for me, and she had a way of making me believe things I'd otherwise doubt. When we arrived, my mom greeted us at the door with her usual warmth, though I could see the surprise in her eyes when she saw Mara. My dad, always quieter, gave me a firm handshake and a small nod, his way of showing approval without words. Over dinner, Mara charmed them effortlessly. She talked about her bakery, her plans for the cafe, and even joked about how I'd almost dropped the bench I'd fixed for her. My mom couldn't stop smiling, and by the end of the night, my dad was telling her stories about my childhood that I'd hoped he'd forgotten. As we drove back to the coast, I realized how much had changed. A year ago, I'd felt like my life was over, like I'd never recover from the betrayal that had shattered everything I thought I knew. But now, with Mara by my side and the pieces of my life slowly coming back together, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope for the future. It was a quiet evening when it all hit me. How far I'd come, how different my life had become. Mara and I were sitting on the porch of the little cottage we'd started renting together, sipping tea and listening to the sound of the waves. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and everything felt right. For so long, I'd been stuck in the past, replaying the pain and betrayal like it was on an endless loop. But now, the memories felt distant, like scars that no longer hurt when I touched them. I realized I was happy, not in a fleeting surface-level way, but in a deep, grounded sense. My days were full, and not just with work. The furniture restoration business had grown into something more than I ever imagined. I'd started teaching small workshops on weekends, helping others see the potential in forgotten pieces the way I once had. Mara had opened her cafe, and watching her light up as she greeted customers or experimented with new recipes was a joy I hadn't expected to share. Our lives were simple but full of meaning. Mornings were spent sipping coffee at her cafe before heading to my workshop. Evenings were for cooking dinner together or walking along the beach. It wasn't a grand, sweeping romance like in the movies. It was better. It was real. As I looked at Mara that evening, her head resting against my shoulder, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Losing Adelice and Jim had felt like the end of everything, but it wasn't. It was the beginning of something better, something truer. I wouldn't say I was thankful for the betrayal. I wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone. But I was grateful for what it had taught me. It had forced me to look inward, to figure out who I was and what I wanted out of life. It had pushed me to take risks, to rebuild, and to open my heart again. I'd learned that happiness wasn't about having a perfect life. It was about finding joy in the imperfections, in the small, everyday moments that make life worth living. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I squeezed Mara's hand and told her how much she meant to me. She smiled, her eyes crinkling in that way I loved, and said, "I'm glad you didn't give up on yourself, Bill. You deserve this." And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed her.